Good morning! So, let's get into it. Today we are going to talk about CSS and JavaScript. Everybody's favorite stuff, right? Well, because I have seen a few people, and not just a few people, a few like very skilled people, and well, they may or may not be my colleagues. I'm not saying that that's the case, but I've seen them try to start getting more into front-end. These specific colleagues have been more server-side oriented developers, which is great. I mean, server-side is probably, if not more important than front-end. This is not a talk about being how important things are, but basically you will see that people, of course, that come from different backgrounds will have different affinities for certain things. And the most common issue I try to explain to my colleagues when they're helping out on the front end or they're doing something like that, I mean, of course they have things that they don't like about what I do, front end and server side as well, because I'm not perfect, even though I may seem like I am. Don't know if that's true. Anywho, the topic of discussion is going to be when to use CSS and when to use JavaScript for stuff on your interface, basically. Now, because it wasn't all that long ago where jQuery was still the standard, and I argue that jQuery was the standard for two main reasons, apart from just ignoring the fact that the overall experience with using jQuery to access DOM elements was nicer than in just vanilla JavaScript. But I argue that the main reason was, first and foremost, that it allowed you to do animations, all that fancy stuff that you wanted to do on a web page. And the second was that it has a nicer Ajax interface for just basically doing web calls, HTTP calls. And so the thing is that today I will argue that almost all, not all, there are a few exceptions, and I'll give you one good example of an exception, but I will argue that almost every single thing you want to do in terms of animations is possible through CSS. And you don't actually need to use JavaScript anymore to do these common transitions of moving things or sliding things out and in and all that stuff. You don't really need it. And let me tell you why. So it was the case that you used to have JavaScript in order to move an element from one place to another, because there was no real nice way of expressing that through CSS. Now, this has been around for a little while, so if you're still doing things with JavaScript, I'll give you a few examples of things you should be doing with CSS rather than with JavaScript. Take this to heart, because the thing is that the next level of animation has come along, and the two main properties that you really need to check out is the opacity property and the transform property. And the reason why you want to look at those is because these are the only two properties right now, as far as I know anyway, that leverages the GPU layer of the device that it's running on. Now, why is that important? Well, it is important because when you're running something on the CPU layer, the computer can't really, it's a much harder operation for it to do. And what's beautiful about using the GPU layer, that it's optimized for doing these graphical changes, and the DOM doesn't, or rather the web page doesn't have to render as much. The browser will not have to repaint everything, because there's I'm not going to go too much into layout and paints and so forth. There's a lot of really good stuff that you can check out, made by the good people at Google. There's a very nice Udacity course about it as well. But anywho, the idea is basically that it's much more performant to use these two properties. And CSS in general is optimized to do these types of things, which is not the case for JavaScript. So if you're still moving things around using like the left property and the top property or something like that, stop doing that immediately. Start looking into Translate 3D or something of the sort, or Translate X or Y, whichever one you prefer. and just have a look at the documentation and the tutorials about that property, because it will be more performant in terms of animations. And so basically the most important things to know about in order to do animations properly in CSS is animations, and then you have transform, which is also extremely important. Opacity is very important to know about for the same reason as transform. And then you need to know a little bit about keyframes, depending on how fancy your animations are going to be. Those are the main things that you should look into, because odds are that these properties will do... Oh, sorry, and transition. Transition is also extremely important. That's the whole... Oh, forgot about that one. That's how you actually express to the browser that, hey, I want these things to transition over a certain period of time. So have a look at that. There's a lot of good stuff. You go to csstricks.com, I think, and just look at their tutorials. They have amazing tutorials on all of these topics. So when does it make sense to use JavaScript for animation purposes? Now, I will argue that there's two strong cases for when you want to do that. And the first and foremost thing is you should use JavaScript as a way to remove or add CSS classes to elements that you want to animate. So if you want to do something in response to an event on the DOM, then don't use JavaScript to animate, in my opinion anyway, don't use JavaScript to animate the actual animation. Just use it as a way of adding or removing a class name that actually has all the properties I was talking about, that, you know, that's initially kickstarts the animation. That's number one. Have that as a general rule. Number two is if you have a need to make a transformation, such as, let's say that you wanted to do something like float a bunch of elements from one position to another, or expand something into full screen or something like that. That is really, really tricky to express without using width. But remember, we're performant programmers here, so we don't want to use width, because width will repaint your UI. It won't be performant. Now, I struggled with this topic a lot, like how do you do this? And then my absolute, I'm not going to kiss him, because I don't think that would be a nice experience for anybody, but Paul Lewis is a genius, like an absolute genius. And he introduced me to the concept of flip. Now, I don't remember what this abbreviation stands for, actually. I'm very sorry to say that, Paul, but this is a genius move. So basically, the problem with using a transform, in this case translate 3D, to position things in a way that allows you to basically expand or move stuff around, is that you need to have an absolute value. You cannot express that you wanted to move a certain percentage or so forth. You need to know ahead of time what it's going to be. And the genius part of this is that he figured out that if basically the idea is that you can use JavaScript to just basically render the page one frame, like an instant or a very extremely short amount of time, much faster than what we humans can perceive. So for us humans, we can't actually see what's happening. You just render that one frame in the finished state of the animation, so you know where everything is supposed to be. And then you save those values using JavaScript, and then you pull everything back to the starting state. And what's beautiful now is that because you did that, you know how far from the starting stage you want things to progress, or how far, like you have the delta between these two values. Now, I'm not gonna get too technical, but the power of this is that now you can actually use transform to do said animation, which is going to be very performant. So have a look at flip. Flip is like, this is really high level stuff. If you can master flip, all your animation, you will be, trust me, your designers are going to love you for this, because your experience you're going to be able to provide using these techniques is going to be completely, it's going to be raising the bar for so many other websites out there. So highly recommend that. So yeah, those are my tips. So in general, take away from this discussion, on my little rant here, start looking into, if you're making an animation, just try to use CSS as much as possible, because that's what it's made for. If you're using JavaScript, use it either to apply a CSS style, like a class or something. Just don't run the animation through JavaScript if you can avoid it. and looking to flip. Those are my 2 tips for you.